In 1974, a school bus driver in rural Ohio could pull over, light a cigarette, and nobody blinked. Kids sat 3 to a seat, with no belts, no padding, and no parents waiting at the stop. That was just Tuesday. Number 17 on this list was actually recommended by the National Safety Council before they quietly removed it from their guidelines. And number 4 was so common across America that when a journalist investigated it in 1981, the Department of Transportation had no explanation for why it was ever allowed. These 25 rules were not accidents. They were policy. Before we start, hit that subscribe button, because what you are about to hear might make you grateful you grew up when you did, or furious your parents never told you. Number 25, standing room only. When buses ran full in the 1970s, and they almost always did, children stood, not crouched, not kneeling, standing upright in the aisle, gripping the backs of seats or each other, swaying like subway commuters on the way to 3rd grade. School districts across the Midwest packed 77 children onto buses designed for 66, and nobody filed a complaint because there was no complaint to file. Federal motor vehicle safety standards in 1977 did not limit the number of students allowed on a school bus. The logic was simple. A standing child was better than a child left at the curb. Mothers waved from porches, watching a bus so full the windows fogged from the inside, and thought nothing of it. The smallest kids got wedged between older ones, feet barely touching the floor, backpacks clutched to their chests. When the driver hit the brakes, everybody lurched forward. You learned to brace yourself by 2nd grade, or you went home with a split lip. Today, a single child standing on a school bus would trigger a district investigation, a parent phone tree, and a segment on the local evening news. Number 24, no seatbelts anywhere. This was not an oversight. It was deliberate engineering. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration argued throughout the 1970s that seatbelts on school buses were unnecessary because the buses themselves were designed with compartmentalization. High-backed padded seats spaced closely together were supposed to absorb the impact. The theory sounded reasonable on paper. In practice, it meant your 7-year-old sat on a vinyl bench with nothing holding her in place while a 12-ton vehicle barreled down a 2-lane highway at 55 miles per hour. If the bus stopped short, the seat back in front of you was your airbag. A 1978 UCLA study found that compartmentalization worked in frontal crashes, but offered almost no protection in side impacts or rollovers. Districts knew this. They kept the policy anyway, because retrofitting 480,000 school buses nationwide would have cost an estimated $1.8 billion. Your parents accepted it because their parents accepted it. Nobody questioned the math until the bodies forced them to. Number 23, the driver decided discipline. The bus driver was judge, jury, and executioner. If a child acted up, the driver handled it right there on Route 9 with the engine idling and 40 kids watching. Drivers could assign seats, confiscate belongings, or pull the bus over and refuse to move until order was restored. Some drivers carried rulers, not for measuring. A 1973 survey by the American School Bus Council found that 68% of drivers considered physical correction an acceptable last resort for dangerous behavior. No cameras, no written reports, no appeals process. Parents backed the driver automatically. If you came home crying that the bus driver grabbed your collar, your father asked what you did to deserve it. The dynamic was absolute. That driver was the adult in charge of a moving vehicle carrying children, and whatever he decided went. School boards trusted drivers to use judgment because hiring oversight was minimal, and training lasted, in many states, fewer than 10 hours. Number 22, open windows at highway speed. Air conditioning on a school bus in the 1970s meant a window you could crank down yourself. Children rode with arms, elbows, and sometimes entire heads hanging out of open windows while the bus cruised at highway speeds. Drivers could not monitor 30 open windows while navigating traffic. The rule said, do not extend body parts beyond the window frame, but enforcement was impossible when every child on the left side had a forearm catching the breeze. In Phoenix and Houston, where September temperatures pushed past 100 degrees, closing windows was not an option. Buses became rolling ovens, so the windows stayed open and children dangled whatever they wanted into the rushing air. Branches, mailboxes, and passing trucks were inches away. A 1976 report from the National Transportation Safety Board documented 14 injuries in a single school year from children struck by objects while leaning from bus windows. The recommendation was better window restrictors. It took until the mid-1980s before most states required them. Kindergartners walked home alone from the stop. The bus dropped 5-year-olds at the corner and drove away. That was the system. No parent signature was required, no visual confirmation that an adult was waiting. The child stepped off the bus, the door folded shut, and the driver moved to the next stop. In suburbs and small towns across America, kindergartners walked 2, 3, sometimes 4 blocks home alone after the bus left them standing on the sidewalk. School policy in most districts stated that the bus stop was the parent's responsibility. If no one was there, the child waited or walked. A 1975 study by the National Education Association found that 41% of kindergarten students were released at bus stops without adult supervision on a regular basis. Mothers were at work, at the grocery store, or tending to younger children. The assumption was that the neighborhood would watch. Somebody's eyes were always on the street. That was the thinking. Whether it held true on every block every afternoon, nobody tracked. Number 20. Smoking drivers. Your bus driver could smoke while driving your children to school. Not in secret, not on a break, behind the wheel in traffic with the windows cracked and ash falling into the defroster vent. Through the 1970s, there was no federal prohibition against smoking on school buses. State laws varied wildly, and most did not address it at all. A 1979 survey by the American Lung Association found that 23% of school bus drivers admitted to smoking on the bus, at least occasionally. Children sat in a sealed metal tube, breathing secondhand smoke for 45 minutes each way. The smell soaked into vinyl seats and clung to coats and backpacks. Kids came home reeking of cigarettes, and their parents assumed it was the driver. They were right. They just did not consider it a problem worth raising. Smoking was normal, everywhere. The bus was not an exception. It was just another room where adults smoked and children breathed. Number 19. Railroad crossings without gates. Buses crossed active railroad tracks daily, often at crossings with no gates, no lights, and no warning beyond a white crossbuck sign nailed to a post. Federal regulations required the driver to stop, open the door, and listen for a train. That was the protocol. Stop, open, listen. In rural Kansas, Nebraska, and Indiana, buses crossed tracks where freight trains ran on irregular schedules and visibility was blocked by grain elevators or tree lines. The driver's ears were the only safety system. A 1974 National Transportation Safety Board investigation into a school bus collision with a freight train in Congers, New York, found that the driver stopped, looked, and proceeded directly into the path of a train obscured by a building. 5 children died. The recommendations called for better crossing infrastructure. Many crossings remained unchanged for another decade because the cost of installing automatic gates fell on the railroad, and the railroads fought it. Number 18. First aid was a box of adhesive bandages. The medical kit on a school bus in the 1970s contained adhesive bandages, a roll of gauze, and maybe a bottle of mercurochrome that had been there since the Kennedy administration. There was no EpiPen, no inhaler, and no emergency contact sheet. If a child had an allergic reaction, an asthma attack, or a seizure, the driver's training was to get to the nearest house with a telephone and call for help. A 1976 survey by the National Association of State Directors of Pupil Transportation found that fewer than 15% of school bus drivers had received any first aid training beyond basic wound care. Children with severe allergies, diabetes, or epilepsy rode the bus with no medical plan, no medication on board, and no driver who knew their condition. The assumption was that emergencies were rare, and when they happened, someone nearby would know what to do. First pattern break. Here is where things take a turn. The rules we have covered so far were dangerous through negligence. The ones coming up were dangerous by design. Adults looked at these situations, thought about them, and decided they were fine. That is a different kind of terrifying. The distance between a school bus in the 1970s and a modern one is not just about technology. It is about what a society was willing to accept happening to its children on the way to school. In urban districts through the 1970s, school buses loaded and unloaded children on active streets without stop arms, flashing lights, or crossing guards. The amber warning lights that are standard today were not federally mandated on new buses until 1977, and even then older buses ran for years without them. Children crossed 2 and 3 lanes of traffic on their own judgment, dodging cars whose drivers had no legal obligation to stop. A 1975 Kansas State University study found that 75% of all school bus fatalities occurred outside the bus during loading and unloading. Children were struck by passing motorists who never saw them or never stopped. The youngest students were the most vulnerable, too short to be seen over the hood of a car and too inexperienced to judge the speed of oncoming traffic. Stop arms with extending crossing guards did not become widespread until the late 1980s, and even then, compliance by motorists remained dangerously low. Number 16. Snow routes with no chains. In Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and across the northern plains, school buses ran in blizzard conditions on routes that would close a modern interstate. Buses climbed icy hills, crossed frozen bridges, and navigated county roads where snowplows had not yet passed. Tire chains were available, but rarely required by district policy, and many drivers considered them a nuisance that slowed the route. A 1978 Minnesota Department of Education report documented 43 school bus slide-offs in a single winter season, including 7 that left the roadway entirely and ended up in ditches or fields. Children inside were thrown from seats, struck by lunchboxes and books, and in 3 cases hospitalized. The standard for canceling school was severe. If the roads were passable, the buses ran. Parents sent children to the stop in sub-zero darkness, trusting that the driver and the bus could handle whatever the sky threw down. Sometimes they could not. Number 15. No background checks for drivers. Through most of the 1970s, school bus driver hiring required a commercial driver's license, a brief physical exam, and little else. Criminal background checks were not standard practice. A 1979 investigation by the Chicago Tribune found that several districts in Illinois had unknowingly employed drivers with prior convictions, including assault, driving under the influence, and in 2 cases, offenses involving minors. The paper's reporting led to legislative hearings, but comprehensive background check requirements did not take effect nationally until the late 1980s and early 1990s, driven state by state. Parents dropped their children at the curb each morning with no way of knowing who was behind the wheel beyond the name stitched on the uniform. The trust was absolute and largely unverified. Number 14. Routes lasting over 90 minutes. In rural America, children rode the bus for extraordinary distances. Routes of 90 minutes or more each way were common in states like Montana, West Virginia, and Mississippi, where consolidated school districts drew students from across entire counties. A 5-year-old could board the bus at 6:15 in the morning in complete darkness and not arrive at school until nearly 8 o'clock. The return trip was the same. Children spent 3 hours a day on a bus with no bathroom, no water, and no supervision beyond the driver. A 1973 report by the Rural Education Association found that students on routes exceeding 75 minutes showed measurably lower academic performance and higher absenteeism. Districts knew the rides were too long, but building new schools cost money the counties did not have, and shortening routes meant hiring more drivers and buying more buses. So the children rode. Number 13. Bullying was a character builder. There was no anti-bullying policy on a 1970s school bus because there was no concept of bullying as a policy concern. Older children dominated the back seats, and younger children sat where they were told. The social hierarchy was enforced through intimidation, and adults considered it a normal part of growing up. If a child came home with a bruise from the bus, the standard parental advice was to hit them back tomorrow. A 1976 study published in the Journal of Educational Psychology found that 60% of students reported experiencing repeated aggression on school buses, but fewer than 10% of those incidents were ever reported to school authorities. Drivers either did not see it, did not care, or considered minor physical conflict between children to be outside their responsibility. The bus was a lawless 45 minutes between home and school, where children learned to navigate power, fear, and survival with no adult intervention. Second pattern break. Consider this. By the time you hit 7th grade in 1975, you had already spent roughly 1,400 hours on a school bus with no seatbelt, no camera, no climate control, and no guarantee that the adult driving had been vetted beyond his ability to shift gears. You had learned to brace for sudden stops, avoid the back row, and cross 4 lanes of traffic on instinct. And your parents considered all of it perfectly fine, because the truth nobody talks about is that the 1970s did not have lower standards for child safety. They had a completely different definition of what safety meant. Number 12. Emergency exits were theory only. Every school bus had a rear emergency door with a sign that read, "Push to open." But emergency evacuation drills were not required by most states until the 1980s. Children had no idea how to open that door, where to go once outside, or what to do if the bus was on its side. A 1977 National Transportation Safety Board review of school bus accidents found that in multiple incidents, children were unable to operate emergency exits, rear doors were jammed or rusted shut, and roof hatches were painted over. The exits existed on paper. In practice, they were decorations. Number 11. Metal dashboards and exposed steel. The interior of a 1970s school bus was built for durability, not for the skulls of children. Seat frames were exposed steel tubing. Dashboard edges were unpadded metal. The floor was ribbed steel covered with rubber matting that often peeled up at the corners. In a sudden stop, a child's face could meet chrome-plated steel at whatever speed the bus had been traveling. Padding requirements for school bus interiors did not become comprehensive until Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 222 was updated in 1977. Even then, buses already in service were not required to retrofit. For years, children rode in buses that were essentially steel boxes with windows. Number 10. Bus monitors were other children. When districts could not afford adult monitors, they appointed older students. A 6th grader might be assigned to sit at the front and report misbehavior. A high school student might ride a younger route as a safety patrol. These children had no training and no authority, and no ability to handle a genuine emergency. A 1974 report by the National PTA noted that student monitors were frequently the targets of bullying themselves and often abandoned the role within weeks. The system relied on children to supervise children in a moving vehicle operated by a single adult whose eyes were supposed to be on the road. School buses of the 1970s ran on diesel engines with emission standards that would be illegal today for a lawnmower. Exhaust fumes routinely entered the cabin through floor seams, cracked windows, and the door mechanism. Children sitting near the rear breathed concentrated diesel particulate for the duration of every ride. A 1979 study by the Environmental Protection Agency measured particulate levels inside school buses and found concentrations up to 8 times higher than ambient outdoor air. The long-term health effects of repeated diesel exhaust exposure in children were not fully understood at the time, but subsequent research has linked it to respiratory illness, reduced lung function, and increased cancer risk. Nobody measured the air quality inside a school bus in 1974. Nobody thought to. Number 8. Field trip buses were whatever was available. When schools organized field trips, the bus that showed up was not always a school bus. Charter coaches, church vans, and repurposed transit vehicles filled the gap when district fleets were stretched thin. These vehicles operated under different safety standards. Charter buses had higher seats, steeper steps, and luggage compartments instead of emergency exits at floor level. A 1975 NTSB investigation found that several fatal field trip accidents involved non-standard vehicles that lacked the compartmentalization features of purpose-built school buses. Children rode in vehicles that were never designed to carry them, supervised by teachers who had never been trained in emergency evacuation procedures for unfamiliar equipment. Number 7. Gravel roads at full speed. Rural routes took school buses down unpaved county roads where dust clouds blocked visibility and loose gravel turned steering into a suggestion. Drivers kept a schedule by running these roads at speeds meant for pavement, sometimes 45 or 50 miles per hour, on surfaces that offered half the traction. A 1976 study by the Iowa Department of Transportation found that school bus accidents on unpaved roads occurred at 3 times the rate of paved road incidents, with rollovers the most common type. The buses were top-heavy by design, and gravel amplified every correction. One overcorrection on a washboard road left 40 children sideways in a ditch. Districts could not pave every road and would not slow every route. Number 6. Winter darkness at both ends. Children in northern states boarded buses in pitch darkness at 6:30 in the morning and were dropped off in darkness at 4:30 in the afternoon during the winter months. No reflective vests, no illuminated bus stops, no crossing lights. A child standing at the edge of a county road in December in northern Minnesota was essentially invisible to oncoming traffic. A 1978 report by the American Association of School Administrators found that pedestrian accidents involving school children were 340% more likely during winter months, with the majority occurring within 200 feet of the bus stop. The solution would have been later start times, reflective gear, or illuminated stops. What districts chose instead was nothing. Number 5. Driver fatigue was routine. Many school bus drivers in the 1970s worked split shifts, driving the morning route, working a second job during the day, and then driving the afternoon route. The position paid poorly. In 1975, the average school bus driver earned less than $4 an hour. To make a living wage, drivers took additional work, arriving for the afternoon route after a full day of physical labor. A 1977 study by the National Research Council found that driver fatigue was a contributing factor in 12% of the school bus accidents reviewed. The study recommended limits on driver work hours. Most states did not implement them for another decade. Parents trusted that the person driving their children home at 3:30 was alert and rested. Many were neither. Third pattern break. What makes these final entries different is that every one of them was eventually fixed. Somebody counted the injuries, measured the risk, and changed the policy. But the fixes came years, sometimes decades, after the danger was obvious. The gap between knowing something was wrong and doing something about it is where the real story lives. Number 4. No stop arm, no flashing lights, just hope. Before the swing-out stop arm became standard equipment, school buses had exactly one signal to tell drivers they were stopping, a set of alternating red lights on the roof. Motorists were expected to notice these lights, recognize what they meant, and stop. Many did not. In the 1970s, an estimated 50,000 vehicles passed stopped school buses illegally every single school day, according to a 1980 National Safety Council estimate. Children stepped off the bus into traffic that had no physical barrier, no mechanical warning, and no consequence for blowing past. The swing out stop arm, the folding sign that extends from the driver's side and forces approaching cars to acknowledge the bus has stopped, did not become widespread until the early 1980s. Until then, the only thing between your child and a passing car was the assumption that drivers would obey a blinking red light. Number 3, asbestos insulation in the bus body. School buses manufactured through the early 1970s used asbestos in brake linings, clutch facings, and in some cases, interior insulation and firewall materials. Every time the driver hit the brakes, microscopic asbestos fibers were released. Children riding directly above the wheel wells sat inches from components that were slowly shedding a known carcinogen. The EPA did not begin regulating asbestos in vehicles until 1989, and school buses built before that date were not recalled or retrofitted. A 1978 Consumer Product Safety Commission study identified school buses as one of several vehicle categories with potential asbestos exposure risk, but no action was taken specific to school fleets. Children rode to school every day inside vehicles that were quietly exposing them to a substance that would later be banned from virtually every building material in America. Number 2, mechanical inspection was annual if you were lucky. School buses in many states were required to pass a mechanical inspection once per year. A bus that passed inspection in September could be running on bald tires by March, have failing brakes by April, and a cracked windshield by May, and still be considered roadworthy until the following fall. A 1976 General Accounting Office report found that 33% of school buses inspected at random during the school year had at least one significant mechanical deficiency, including brake failure, steering problems, and structural rust. The report recommended semi-annual or quarterly inspections. Many states did not adopt stricter schedules until the 1990s. Your child rode a bus that might not have been inspected since before they were enrolled. Number 1, children crossed behind the bus. This was the rule that killed more children than any other single practice in school bus history. Through the 1970s, many districts taught children to cross behind the bus after exiting, where the driver could not see them. The logic was that crossing in front put children in the path of oncoming traffic. Crossing behind kept them on the bus's side of the road. The problem was that drivers had no rear-view visibility behind a school bus. Mirrors showed the sides, not the rear. A child crossing behind the bus walked directly into the blind spot of a vehicle that might begin moving at any moment. A 1977 Kansas State University study that analyzed a decade of school bus pedestrian fatalities found that children struck while crossing behind the bus accounted for the single largest category of deaths. The study's findings led to a nationwide reversal of crossing procedures. By the early 1980s, virtually every district in America had switched to the front crossing rule, where drivers could see the child in their mirrors and oncoming traffic could see the child in the road. But for the families who lost children to the old rule, the change came with a cost that no policy update could repay. Every single one of these 25 rules existed because adults believed they were good enough. Tell me in the comments which one shocked you the most. If you rode a school bus in the 1970s, tell me what I missed. I guarantee there are stories out there worse than anything on this list.